At dinner, my son told me, "You watch the kids while we travel. If you don't like it, leave." He thought I had nowhere else to go, until I folded my napkin, stood up, and told him he could start paying his own bills. What he didn't know was that I had already seen where my house money went, and I was done being his plan. Michael's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. A piece of chicken slid off the tines and landed on Jessica's grandmother's tablecloth, and for a long moment nobody moved to wipe it up. "What did you say?" His voice cracked on the second word, and for one single second, he sounded like the boy who used to call me from the school nurse's office pretending he had a stomachache when what he really had was a math test he hadn't studied for. "I said I signed papers this morning. Arthur Hale drew them up 2 weeks ago. I just hadn't found the right moment to sign them." 2 weeks. Jessica's wineglass tipped when her elbow caught it, and red ran toward the breadbasket. Nobody caught it. What kind of papers? Michael wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding, the way he used to demand a second dessert at 9 years old, like volume alone could change what was true. The kind that frees a joint account when the co-owner reports unauthorized withdrawals. I lifted my purse off the back of the chair, slow, the way you move around something that might still bite. $31,200, Michael. Since March. I have the statements. All of them. His face did something I hadn't seen since he was 26, and I'd caught him lying about the car he'd wrecked. The mask didn't come off all at once. It slipped at the corners first. The smile still technically there, but nothing behind the eyes to hold it up. "Mom," softer now, reaching for the version of me that folded. "Mom, whatever this looks like, it looks like $800 for my mother's rocking chair." I said it evenly. I'd practiced saying it evenly, alone in the storage closet at 2 in the morning, so it wouldn't come out as a scream. "It looks like a Cancun trip on a business account. It looks like a house that sold in 9 days for $190,000 to a man named Kevin Ostrander, who I understand you went to Penn State with." The room went very quiet. Claire, 13 years old, stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in her hands, and she didn't look surprised. She looked like she'd been waiting for this dinner her whole short life. "You don't know what you're talking about," Michael said, but it came out thin, and Jessica had gone the color of the tablecloth. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know Kevin Ostrander relisted that house 8 weeks later for $239,000. I know because Arthur pulled the county records Tuesday afternoon, right around the time he was also calling the bank to flag the withdrawals. Funny how those two things happened on the same day." I looped my purse strap over my shoulder. "There's an envelope under your front door, Michael. I left it there before dinner, in case you were wondering why you kept checking your phone during the salad course. It's addressed to Richard Voss." He stood up so fast his chair went over backward. "You had no right. I had every right. It's my money. It was my house. And Richard Voss has every right to know that his fiduciary advisor spent the last 4 months moving his elderly mother's assets around like a shell game." I looked at Jessica, who wouldn't meet my eyes anymore, and then at Claire, who I would miss more than anything else in that house. "I'll call you about the children, not about anything else. There's nothing else to discuss." I walked out through the kitchen because it was closer to the door, and Lily's crayon drawing of our family, 5 stick figures holding hands under a sun with a smiling face, was still taped to the refrigerator. I didn't take it. I told myself I'd get a copy later. I was wrong about that, but not about much else. Dorothy Ames had been in my church pew 2 rows back for 11 years. She'd buried a husband and a sister in that time, and never once asked me for anything, which is probably why she was the first person I called from the parking lot, my hands shaking too hard to get the seatbelt latched. "Come now," she said. "No questions. Just an address, and a porch light she promised to leave on." Her guest room smelled like cedar and had a real bed with a headboard, and I lay in it that first night staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like Florida, and I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the crying to come right away, in the parking lot or on the drive over, and it doesn't always. Sometimes it takes longer to believe a thing is really over than it takes to leave it. What I felt instead, lying in Dorothy's guest room at 11:40 that night, was something closer to arithmetic. $31,200 from the joint account. $800 for the furniture, of which I'd later learn only $90 ever touched a bank statement I could see. The rest, Michael told the consignment shop, had been handled in cash for Mom's convenience. $149,000 of daylight between what the house sold for and what it was worth 8 weeks later. I did the math 3 times before I fell asleep, and it came out the same every time. And somewhere in there, around the 3rd pass, I finally understood that this wasn't a fight about a napkin or a dinner or a son who'd forgotten his manners. This was a case. And I had spent 72 years being underestimated by people who assumed a woman my age couldn't tell the difference. Arthur Hale's office hadn't changed since he'd handled my husband David's estate 11 years earlier. Same brown leather chairs, same smell of old paper and coffee that had been reheated too many times. He was 78 himself now, silver-haired, moving a little slower than he used to, but his mind hadn't lost a step, and 34 years of elder law practice showed in the way he laid 3 folders on the desk between us before I'd even finished my coffee. "I want to be plain with you, Eleanor," he said. "What your son did has a name. Several names, actually, depending on which piece of it we're talking about. The account withdrawals, that's financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under state code, and given the dollar amount, it crosses the felony threshold on its own. The house sale is a separate matter. If Kevin Ostrander bought that property below market value with the intent to resell at a profit he split with Michael, that's fraud and potentially undue influence, since Michael had access to your affairs and pressured a 9-day close. I didn't feel pressured at the time, I said, and it came out smaller than I meant it to. That's what bothers me most. I trusted him. That's exactly what undue influence looks like from the inside. It doesn't feel like a con. It feels like help. Arthur slid a legal pad toward me. I need you to write down every number you remember, every date. I know you have photographs of the statements. I want copies of those today, and I want the originals photographed again through a service that timestamps the file so nobody can claim later that they were altered. Chain of custody, I said. He looked up, surprised, and something like pride crossed his face. That's right. You've been paying attention. I had 4 months with nothing to do but pay attention. He nodded slowly. Then here's what happens next. I'm filing a report with the county's financial crimes unit today. I've worked with a detective there before. Good, thorough, doesn't rattle. Her name is Maria Ruiz. I'm also going to bring in a forensic accountant, a man named Tom Reyes, to trace the house sale and the withdrawal pattern properly, because juries and judges believe spreadsheets more than they believe grieving mothers, and I intend for you to have both. And the envelope? The one I left for his boss? Arthur allowed himself the smallest smile. That was your decision, not mine. And frankly, it was a smart one. Sterling Crest is a registered investment advisory firm. Michael holds a Series 65 license. If his employer learns he's under investigation for financial exploitation of a family member, they have a legal and regulatory obligation to review his conduct, and likely to report it themselves, given how compliance departments protect their own licenses. He closed the folder. You may have started 3 fires with 1 match, Eleanor. I'd get comfortable. This is going to take a few months, and it's going to get uglier before it gets clean. I've been uncomfortable for 4 months. I said. I can manage a few more. Detective Maria Ruiz met me at Arthur's office 2 days later instead of the station, which she said she preferred for cases like mine. Less intimidating, more likely to get a complete account. She was younger than I expected, maybe 45, with the kind of steady eye contact that made you feel like you were the only case on her desk, even though I later learned she was carrying 11 others. 14 years in financial crimes, she told me, setting a small recorder on the table between us. Elder exploitation cases are actually the fastest growing category we work. People think it's romance scams and gift cards. Half the time it's family. Sons, daughters, grandchildren with power of attorney and no supervision. She clicked the recorder on. I'm going to ask you to walk me through everything, start to finish, in your own words. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. I talked for 2 hours. I told her about the house, the storage closet, the trips, Jessica's bracelet, the statements I'd photographed with my hands shaking so badly the first 3 shots came out blurred. I told her about Claire unlocking her phone and showing me the messages, and Ruiz's jaw tightened at that part in a way she didn't try to hide. How old is Claire? 13. I may need to speak with her eventually, with her parents' knowledge, or without it if there's reason to believe her safety's a factor. We'll cross that when we get there. She flipped a page in her notebook. Tell me about the house sale again. Slower this time. Every date you can remember. When I finished, she sat back and looked at me for a long moment. Mrs. Whitfield, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound. This is one of the cleanest documentation trails I've seen in a case like this in years. Most of these were working from memory and a couple of angry text messages. You gave me statements, receipts, a jewelry purchase, a furniture sale discrepancy, and a real estate flip with a named buyer. That's not luck. That's a woman who paid attention when everyone around her assumed she wasn't. I didn't cry then either, but something in my chest loosened for the first time in months, hearing a stranger with a badge say out loud what I'd only ever said to myself at 2 in the morning. Tom Reyes came back to Arthur's office 11 days later with a manila folder thick enough to need a rubber band, and he laid it open like a man setting a table. The house is the real story here, he said. He had the flat, unhurried voice of someone who'd spent 30 years finding numbers other people had tried to hide. County records show the property assessed at $218,000 as of last year. It sold to Kevin Ostrander on March the 14th for $190,000, cash, closing in 9 days. County records show the property assessed at $218,000 as of last year. It sold to Kevin Ostrander on March the 14th for $190,000, cash, closing in 9 days, which, for anyone who's ever sold real estate, is nearly unheard of without something unusual driving the timeline. He told me buyers were backing out and we had to move fast. I said, there's no record of any other offer. I checked the listing history. It wasn't publicly listed at all. It was sold directly, off-market, to a single buyer who happens to have roomed with your son at Penn State from 2001 to 2003, according to a university alumni page I found archived online. Reyes turned a page. 8 weeks after closing, Ostrander relisted the property for $239,000. It sold for $231,000, minus his carrying costs and a light cosmetic renovation, new countertops, paint. Ostrander cleared roughly $31,000 in profit on a property he held for under 3 months and never lived in. And Michael? I asked, though some part of me already knew. I can't prove where Ostrander's profit went without a subpoena for his bank records, which Detective Ruiz is pursuing now. But I can tell you this, 6 days after that second closing, $18,000 appeared in an account jointly held by Michael and Jessica Whitfield, deposited as a personal check from Kevin Ostrander, memo line marked loan repayment. Reyes looked at me over his glasses. Mrs. Whitfield, I've done this a long time. I have never once seen a loan get repaid before the lender remembers ever making one. Ostrander has no record of borrowing from your son. Not on paper, not that I can find. I sat with that for a moment. $18,000, on top of the $31,000 from the account, on top of the $800 for the furniture that had really only netted $90. That's not a son who made a mistake, I said quietly. No, ma'am. Reyes said, that's a plan. I'm Denise Okafor from Adult Protective Services called on a Thursday, and I nearly didn't answer because I'd started to flinch at unknown numbers the way you flinch at a car backfiring after you've heard a real gunshot. I want to be upfront with you, she said once I picked up. APS opened a file after Detective Ruiz's report crossed our desk. Normally our involvement means we're checking on the welfare of the older adult. That's you, Mrs. Whitfield. And I want you to know this isn't an accusation. It's a protection. 11 years I've done this job, and the fastest way to help someone like you is to get ahead of anything the other side might try to claim later. What would they try to claim? There was a pause on the line. Brief but deliberate, the kind professionals give you before they tell you something they know will land hard. Sometimes, in cases like this, the person being investigated tries to flip the narrative, claims the older adult is confused, or being manipulated by someone else. A lawyer, a friend, a detective. It's a defense we see often enough that I like my clients prepared for it before it happens, not after. She let that sit. Has anyone suggested you might not be thinking clearly, forgetting things, anything like that? I thought of Jessica's voice at dinner 3 weeks before all this. Syrupy and careful. Eleanor, are you sure you took your blood pressure pill this morning? You seemed a little foggy yesterday. I'd brushed it off at the time. I hadn't taken a blood pressure pill wrong once in 6 years. There was a comment, I said slowly. More than one, actually. I didn't think much of it. I'd like you to think of it now, Denise said. Write down every instance you can remember. Dates, what was said, who was in the room, and Mrs. Whitfield, I'd strongly recommend you schedule a full cognitive evaluation with your own physician in the next 2 weeks. Not because I think you need one, because if this goes where I suspect it might, you want that documentation dated before anyone else tries to write the story first. I hung up the phone and sat very still in Dorothy's kitchen for a long time. I understood, in that moment, that I had not actually reached the bottom of this yet. I had only reached the part where I could finally see how deep it went. Richard Voss called Arthur's office, not mine, which I understood later was standard. Compliance officers don't call the family of the person they're investigating. Not directly, not with lawyers already circling. But Arthur relayed the conversation to me almost word for word, and I've turned it over in my mind so many times since that I can nearly hear the man's voice myself. Sterling Crest Wealth Management had placed Michael on administrative leave the same afternoon the envelope arrived, not because of what was in it alone, though that had been enough to open a file, but because a compliance review triggered by an outside complaint is mandatory under the firm's regulatory obligations. And Voss, 22 years in wealth management himself, wasn't about to let one advisor's conduct put the whole firm's registration at risk. He asked me, Arthur told me, whether I understood what I was doing to my son's career. I told him I wasn't the one who did anything to his career. His son did that the day he used his mother's retirement savings as a personal line of credit. 3 weeks later, Sterling Crest terminated Michael's employment outright, citing violations of fiduciary conduct standards. The firm was required to file the termination reason with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, which meant it would live permanently on his public record, the same public record any future client, any future employer could pull up with a simple search. 31 years old, and the first line anyone would read about his career would be about this. I won't pretend I felt nothing when Arthur told me. I felt something. I'm just not sure sorry is the right word for it, and I've stopped apologizing to myself for that. The guardianship petition came exactly 19 days after the dinner, and it came the way I imagine most ambushes do. Quietly, on paper, delivered by a process server to Dorothy's front porch while I was in the backyard hanging laundry. Of all things, sheets snapping in a mild spring wind, and Dorothy calling my name in a voice I didn't recognize. Michael was petitioning for emergency temporary guardianship over my person and my finances. The filing cited concerning cognitive changes, erratic financial decision-making including the abrupt sale of long-held real estate, and increasing social isolation and susceptibility to undue influence from third parties. That last phrase I understood immediately, meant Arthur. It meant Dorothy. It meant anyone who had helped me instead of controlling me. There was a hearing date. 5 days out. Emergency petitions move fast by design, because the law assumes urgency means real danger. And I understood, reading it standing in Dorothy's kitchen with laundry pins still in my other hand, that Michael had found the one weapon left that could actually take everything. Not just the money this time, but me. My name on my own decisions. My right to say where I lived and who I saw, and what happened to what remained of what I had. 5 days, I said out loud, and my voice didn't sound like mine. Dorothy took the papers gently out of my hand and set them on the counter like they might catch fire. Then we have 5 days, she said. Call Arthur. I did. He answered on the second ring, and for the first time since I'd known him, I heard something sharp enter his voice. Not panic. Arthur didn't do panic, but the focused, cold clarity of a man who'd just been handed exactly the fight he'd expected and had already started preparing for. I need everything by tomorrow morning, he said. Every statement, every photo, every text Claire showed you. I need her willing to give a statement to Denise Okafor if her parents allow it, and if they don't, I need to know that too, because a judge will ask why a 13-year-old isn't permitted to speak. I need Tom Reyes's full report finalized, not draft. And Eleanor, I need you to see a physician for a full cognitive workup tomorrow, first thing, someone with credentials that means something in a courtroom. I have a name, Dr. Elaine Fitzgerald. Board-certified geriatric psychiatrist, does forensic evaluations for exactly this kind of hearing. I'm calling her office the moment we hang up. And if she finds something? I asked, and I hated how small the question came out, because some ugly, frightened part of me, 72 years old and suddenly unsure of everything, wondered for one terrible second whether Jessica's little comments about foggy mornings had ever been a hair right. She won't, Arthur said without hesitation, and something in his certainty steadied me more than any test result could have. Eleanor, I've watched you build a documentation trail in 4 months that most attorneys couldn't assemble with a paralegal and a subpoena. That is not what confusion looks like. That is what being underestimated your whole life and finally deciding to prove everyone wrong looks like. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. I did not sleep. I lay in Dorothy's guest room under the water stain shaped like Florida, and I made lists in my head. Every date, every dollar, every small, cruel comment dressed up as concern. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, I stopped being afraid and started being furious instead, which I found I could work with a great deal better. Dr. Fitzgerald's evaluation took 3 hours the next day and involved more memory tests and word puzzles than I'd done since grade school. And at the end of it, she looked at me with the particular directness of someone who has delivered a great many difficult results and knew this wasn't going to be one of them. Mrs. Whitfield, your cognitive function is entirely within normal range for your age, actually above average on several measures, particularly recall and executive function. I'll have my full written evaluation to Mr. Hale by tomorrow morning, and I want to be clear in that report and clear to you now. There is nothing in 3 hours of testing that would support a finding of incapacity. Whoever suggested otherwise either doesn't know what incapacity looks like or knows exactly what it looks like and is hoping the judge doesn't. I called Claire that night from Dorothy's kitchen phone because I didn't want it on my cell in case anyone checked it later, and I told her, carefully, that she didn't have to say yes to anything. Grandma, she said, and her voice had a steadiness in it that broke my heart a little because 13 is too young to sound that certain about anything. I want to tell the truth. I've wanted to since I showed you my phone. Nobody's stopping me. Nobody's stopping me. Denise Okafor took Claire's statement 2 days before the hearing in a quiet room at the County Family Services building, with Jessica present but silent in the corner, her face unreadable, and Claire walked through the messages she'd found, the ones about the storage room, about not understanding the accounts, about the nanny money, in a clear, unhurried voice that Denise later told Arthur was the most composed testimony I've taken from a minor in years. The hearing was held in a probate courtroom that smelled like every government building I'd ever been in, floor wax and old paper, and Judge Patricia Coldwell presided from a bench that felt very far away and very close at the same time. Michael sat across the aisle with his own attorney, a younger man with an expensive tie and the strained posture of someone who'd taken a case he was beginning to suspect he couldn't win. Jessica wasn't there. I noticed that before I noticed almost anything else. Arthur went first. He laid it out in the plain, unhurried way he did everything. The bank statements marked as Exhibit A through E, the county property records as Exhibit F, Tom Reyes's forensic accounting summary as Exhibit G, Dr. Fitzgerald's written evaluation as Exhibit H. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. Numbers, laid out cleanly enough, do their own shouting. Your Honor, he said, the petitioner alleges cognitive decline and susceptibility to undue influence as grounds for emergency guardianship. What the evidence actually shows is a woman of sound mind who, over a period of 4 months, quietly documented a pattern of financial exploitation carried out against her by the very person now asking this court to strip her of her rights. I'd ask the court to consider the timing alone. This petition was filed 19 days after Mrs. Whitfield reported unauthorized withdrawals to the police. That is not concern for a mother's welfare. That is retaliation. Michael's attorney tried. He argued isolation. He argued the sudden house sale as evidence of poor judgment, conveniently omitting who had orchestrated that sale. And he called it understandable concern from a loving son observing changes in his aging mother. But when Judge Coldwell asked him directly whether he had reviewed Dr. I. Fitzgerald's evaluation, filed the day before, he hesitated long enough that the answer was obvious before he gave it. Then Claire's statement was read into the record, because Denise had arranged it as a sworn deposition rather than live testimony, sparing her the courtroom itself, and I watched Michael's face while the words were read, his own daughter's account of finding messages between her parents, discussing how her grandmother wouldn't understand the accounts well enough to question it. I watched something in him finally break in a way that had nothing left to hide behind. Judge Coldwell did not take long to rule. I want to be direct, she said, looking not at Arthur, not at Michael's attorney, but at Michael himself. Petitions for emergency guardianship exist to protect vulnerable adults from genuine harm. They are not a tool for a party under active criminal investigation to seize control of the very assets and testimony that investigation depends on. I find no credible evidence of incapacity. I find substantial evidence of financial exploitation perpetrated against the respondent by the petitioner. This petition is denied in full, and I am referring the filing itself to the district attorney's office for review as a potential act of retaliation against a reporting victim. I did not cry in that courtroom either. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the same hands that had once folded a napkin twice at a dinner table before I stood up and changed the entire direction of my life, and I let 72 years of being told to be patient, to be grateful, to not make a fuss, settle quietly into something that finally felt like peace. The criminal case moved faster than Arthur had predicted, largely, he said, because Tom Reyes's paper trail was so clean the district attorney's office barely had to build a case. They mostly had to organize the one already sitting in front of them. Assistant District Attorney Priya Nandakumar, who'd handled elder exploitation cases for 6 years, and told me once gently, over the phone, that mine was the best documented one I've seen since I started this job, filed charges against Michael for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult in the first degree. A felony given the amount involved crossed well past $150,000 once the house fraud was factored in alongside the direct withdrawals. Kevin Ostrander, facing his own exposure once Ruiz's subpoena came through, and the $18,000 loan repayment turned out to have no loan behind it, agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge, which meant Michael no longer had anywhere left to hide behind a friend's silence. He took a plea eventually. Arthur told me most of these cases end that way. Once the documentation is strong enough that trial becomes a bigger risk than admission, to financial exploitation and 1 count of fraud connected to the property sale. 3 years. With the possibility of parole after serving a portion, plus a restitution order requiring repayment of the full amount the court could trace. $149,000, the number I'd first calculated alone at 11:40 at night in Dorothy's guest room, now made official by a judge's signature. FINRA barred him from the securities industry entirely once the criminal conviction was entered. Not a suspension, a permanent bar, the kind of thing that follows a name forever if anyone bothers to look. And in a business built on trust, people always eventually look. Jessica filed for divorce 4 months after the hearing. I don't know everything that happened in that house after I left it, and I've made my peace with not knowing all of it. What I do know is that she called me once, in a voice that had lost every bit of its old syrupy sweetness, and said only, "I didn't know how deep it went. I should have looked harder. I'm sorry, Eleanor." I told her I believed her about not knowing, though I'm still not entirely sure that's true. I've decided it doesn't matter as much as making sure Claire, Noah, and Lily still have a grandmother who shows up. It's been 8 months now since that dinner. I live in a small apartment 2 miles from Dorothy's, my own name on the lease, my own key, a kitchen window that looks out over a little courtyard instead of an alley. The restitution money hasn't all come through yet. Arthur says these things arrive in pieces, sometimes for years, and I've stopped counting the days the way I used to count dollars. Some of it did come through, though, enough that when I walked past Miller's consignment on 5th Street in October and saw a familiar rocking chair sitting in the front window, worn oak, a small burn mark on the left armrest from a candle my mother knocked over in 1974, I walked inside and bought it back for $210 without haggling once. It sits on my new porch now. It creaks the exact same way it always did. Claire comes every other Sunday, sometimes with Noah and Lily when the custody schedule allows it, and we don't talk about her father much. She showed me a text last month, a school project actually, about a woman she admires, and she'd written about me. My grandmother taught me that paying attention isn't the same as staying quiet. She wrote, "Sometimes it's how you win." I keep thinking about the napkin, how small a thing it was, folding it twice before I stood up. I've replayed that moment more times than I can count, and I still don't know exactly what made that the night instead of any of the 100 nights before it. Maybe it was the jewelry receipt in the wastebasket. Maybe it was Claire's face in the doorway, already knowing what I hadn't let myself know yet. Maybe 72 years is just how long it took me to understand that being useful and being loved are not the same thing, and I'd spent most of my life mistaking one for the other. Michael writes to me sometimes from where he is now. I haven't answered yet. Arthur says that's my right. And Denise Okafor, who still checks in on me once a season out of what I think has become genuine friendship rather than obligation, says the same. I believe I'll answer eventually, just not yet. Not until I'm certain the answer isn't for him, it's for me. He thought I had nowhere else to go. I had somewhere else to go the entire time. I just hadn't gone there yet.